The book was never supposed to exist. Sable Marishaw had written the first page on a night when loneliness had become unbearable, when the silence of her tiny chamber in the eastern wing of Harrogate Castle had pressed against her chest like a stone. She had stolen a candle from the kitchen stores, smuggled ink from the record-keeper's desk, and filled the first sheet of rough parchment with words she could never speak aloud. Words about him. She had not used his name. She was not foolish enough for that. In her story, the Alpha King of Craythorne became a fictional ruler named the Wolf Lord of Ashenmere. His dark hair became dark hair. His voice, the one that made her pulse stutter every time he spoke her name in the corridors, became the voice of a character. A safe distance. A necessary lie. But the details were real. Every single one. The way he tilted his head when he listened, as if the speaker were the only soul in the room. The scar beneath his left ear from a challenge fight at 17. The way his hands, enormous and scarred across the knuckles, could hold a quill with surprising delicacy when he worked late at his desk. The way those hands had once caught her wrist when she stumbled on the stairs and held it for 3 heartbeats longer than necessary, while his silver-gray eyes searched her face with an expression she still could not name. That had been the beginning. Over 6 months, the pages had multiplied. What started as a single scene became a chapter, then 5, then 12. Sable wrote in stolen hours, hiding the growing manuscript beneath the loose board under her bed, the one spot in the servants' quarters that no one ever checked. The story she wrote was simple. A healer of common blood falls in love with a king who is promised to a high-born woman. They meet in secret. They share truths no one else hears. And the king realizes that the bond pulling him toward this ordinary woman is the fated mate bond, the rarest and most sacred connection a wolf can experience. It was fiction, except that it was not. Because everything Sable wrote into her novel had already happened between her and Roderick Vale, the Alpha King of Craythorne. The secret meetings in the lower garden after midnight, the conversations that stretched until the sky turned pale. The night he had pressed his forehead to hers in the shadow of the old oak and whispered that he could feel something between them, something his wolf recognized, something he had never felt with anyone else. He had not bitten her. He had not claimed her. He had not spoken the formal words of the mate bond, but he had kissed her. Once, in the darkness. With his hands trembling against her jaw and his breath ragged and his wolf glowing behind his eyes like embers. And then he had pulled away and said, "Not yet. Not until I can do this properly. Not until you have the position and protection you deserve." Sable had waited. Through the winter council sessions, through the trade negotiations, through the endless parade of noble daughters. She had waited, and she had written, because writing was the only place she could be honest about what was happening to her heart. And then, the Ascension Ball had been announced. Sable stood now in the servants' gallery above the great hall of Harrogate, her fingers gripping the carved railing until her knuckles ached. Below her, 300 wolves in formal dress filled the vast chamber. Silver banners hung from every pillar. A string ensemble played something stately and precise near the western alcove. The Ascension Ball was supposed to be a celebration of the king's 5th year on the throne. But the council had demanded that Roderick announce his intended queen tonight. 5 years without an heir was dangerous. 5 years without a betrothal was an insult. The council had given him an ultimatum, and tonight was the deadline. Sable pressed her hand against her chest, where a folded piece of parchment rested inside her dress. A note she had written that afternoon. A note that contained the only secret more dangerous than her manuscript. She was carrying his child. One night, 3 weeks ago, when the restraint between them had finally broken like a dam. One night in the lower garden, on his cloak spread across the frost-hardened earth, when he had claimed her body with a reverence that made her weep. He had bitten the inside of her left wrist during the act, a half-claim, A promise mark. Not the full mating bite, but something that bound them nonetheless. The mark still tingled beneath her sleeve, and the child still grew beneath her heart. She had planned to tell him tonight. Had practiced the words in front of her small mirror until they sounded steady. Had imagined his face when he learned that the bond between them had already created something permanent. But now, watching him stand on the dais below in his ceremonial black coat, his jaw tight and his silver eyes scanning the room with an expression that looked almost desperate, she felt the first crack in her certainty. Lords and ladies of Craythorne. The voice belonged to High Counselor Branneth, a lean man with a face like carved granite and eyes that had never once acknowledged Sable's existence. His Majesty the Alpha King will now address the assembly regarding the matter of the royal union. The hall fell silent. Sable stopped breathing. Roderick stepped forward. His movements were wrong. She knew his body the way she knew her own handwriting, every rhythm and habit memorized through months of secret observation and one night of intimate knowledge. He moved tonight as if his limbs belonged to someone else. Stiff. Disconnected. His eyes, those silver gray eyes that had blazed with heat when he looked at her in the garden, were dull. Empty. "I have consulted with my council," Roderick said, and his voice was flat. Mechanical. A recitation, not a declaration. "And I have made my decision regarding the future of the throne." From the crowd, a woman stepped forward. Tall. Auburn hair arranged in elaborate coils. A gown of white silk that caught the candlelight like water. Phaedra Kendrosian. Daughter of the most powerful military house in the Eastern Territories. The woman whose father commanded 4,000 warriors and controlled every mountain pass between Craythorne and the sea. "I will take Phaedra of House Kendrosian as my queen and bonded mate." The hall erupted in applause, and in the gallery above, Sable Marishaw felt the promise mark on her wrist ignite with a pain so sudden and so savage that she collapsed against the railing, her vision going white at the edges. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard the crowd cheering, heard the Kendrosian family howling with triumph, heard the High Counselor pronouncing blessings she could not distinguish through the agony radiating from her wrist up through her arm and into her chest. She looked down through tear-flooded eyes and saw Roderick take Phaedra Kendrosian's hand. He did not look up. He did not search the gallery where he knew she always watched. He did not hesitate, or flinch, or show any sign that the woman he had claimed 3 weeks ago was shattering 10 feet above his head. Sable's free hand moved instinctively downward. The child. Their child. Already growing while its father pledged himself to another woman as if the mother did not exist. A sound escaped her throat. Not a sob. Something deeper. Something that felt like a piece of her soul tearing loose. She ran. Through the servants' corridors, past the kitchen stores where she had stolen her first candle 6 months ago. Her wrist burned with every step, as if the half-claim was being ripped out of her flesh one nerve at a time. She reached her chamber and slammed the door. Her hands shook so violently she could barely function, but she forced herself to move. She pulled her traveling sack from beneath the bed. A change of clothes. Her pouch of dried herbs. Her mother's pendant. Her hand brushed the loose board. The manuscript. 212 pages of truth hidden beneath the floor. She should take it. She should burn it. But her wrist screamed, and the baby shifted inside her, and celebration echoed through the walls. Leave it. Let it rot. Let it join every other forgotten thing in this place. Sable pulled her cloak around her shoulders, pressed her hand to her belly, and slipped through the servants' gate into the bitter cold of the winter night. She did not look back. She did not see the shadow in the corridor behind her, watching her leave with wide, horrified eyes. And she did not know that in 3 days, those eyes would belong to the person who would find her manuscript, read every word, and carry it straight to the Alpha King. The first page was enough to destroy him. Roderick Vale sat in his private study 3 days after the Ascension Ball, staring at a stack of parchment that his chief steward, old Haskell, had placed on his desk with trembling hands and a face the color of ash. This was found beneath the floorboards of a chamber in the Eastern Servants' Wing, Your Majesty. The room belonged to a woman named Sable Marishaw. She appears to have left the castle the night of the ball. Roderick had not recognized the name. That was the first thing that shattered him. He had not recognized the name of the woman he had kissed in the garden. The woman whose wrist he had bitten in a half-claim so powerful his wolf had nearly taken complete control. The woman who had consumed his thoughts for 6 months, and whose absence, even now, left a hollow ache in his chest that he could not explain. Because 3 days ago, Roderick Vale had woken from what felt like a drugged sleep to find himself betrothed to Phaedra Kendrasian, and he could not remember how it had happened. The last thing he remembered clearly was dressing for the Ascension Ball. His valet had brought him a cup of spiced wine, a gift from the Kendrasian delegation, and he had drunk it because refusing a gift from a visiting house was a diplomatic insult. After that, everything was fog. Fragments. The sound of applause. A woman's hand in his. Branneth's voice speaking words that sounded far away. And then he had woken in his chamber the following morning with Phaedra Kendrasian sitting in his receiving room, calling him my betrothed, in a voice like polished steel, and a hollow feeling in his chest that made his wolf howl in distress. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, terribly wrong, and he could not identify what it was. Only that his wolf clawed at the inside of his skull with increasing desperation, and that a spot on the roof of his mouth burned as if he had bitten into something that left a permanent mark. Now he understood why. The manuscript. Roderick read the first page with numb fingers, then the second, then the third. By the 10th page, his hands were shaking. By the 50th, his wolf was pacing inside him with a fury that made the candlelight flicker. By the 100th, the King of Craythorne was weeping. She had written everything. Not with his name, but with details so precise that every word landed like a blow, the scar beneath his left ear, the way he held a quill, the conversation they had shared about his mother's death, a conversation he had never had with anyone else in his life. The night in the garden when he had pressed his forehead to hers and felt the mate bond ignite between them like a match struck in a dark room. She called him the Wolf Lord of Ashenmere. She called herself a character named Ember. But there was no fiction here. Every scene was a memory. Every line of dialogue was something he had actually said. And then he reached the chapter where the Wolf Lord claimed Ember beneath the winter sky, and the words blurred because he was reading about a night he could barely remember, described by a woman who remembered every detail with devastating clarity, the half-claim on her wrist, his wolf's reaction, the way she had whispered his name afterward, not the fictional name, but his real name, and how she had pressed her face into his neck and breathed him in as if memorizing the scent for a future she feared would never come. Roderick slammed the manuscript down and stood so abruptly his chair crashed backward. Haskell! The steward appeared in the doorway instantly. The woman who lived in that chamber. Sable Marishaw. Where is she? She departed the night of the ball, Your Majesty. No one saw her leave. No one has seen her since. Find her. Your Majesty, the betrothal celebrations begin tomorrow. The Kendrosian delegation expects. Find her! The roar shook the windows. Roderick's eyes had gone fully silver, his wolf surging forward with a force that cracked the stones beneath his feet. I do not care about celebrations. I do not care about the Kendrosians. Find her, Haskell. Find her now. The steward fled. Roderick sank back into his chair and picked up the manuscript again. His eyes found the passage where Ember described the promise mark on her wrist, the half-claim, the bond that was incomplete but unbreakable. And then he read the final chapter, the one where Ember discovers she is carrying the Wolf Lord's child, the one where she stands in a gallery above a great hall. watching the man she loves choose another woman, and feels the promise mark burn as her world collapses. The one where she runs. Roderick read the last line 3 times. Then he pressed the manuscript to his chest, curled forward over his desk, and made a sound that was not entirely human. She had been carrying his child. She had been right there, in the gallery above the hall, watching him betray her, and he had not even known she existed, because someone had poured something into his wine that had stolen his wolf, his memories, and his mate in a single night. The promise mark on the roof of his mouth, the place where a wolf's claiming bite left its echo, burned with sudden, searing intensity. He could feel her. Faint. Distant. Moving away from him with every passing hour, but alive. Roderick Vale opened his eyes, and they were no longer the silver gray of a king at court. They were pure, molten silver, the color of a wolf who has found his mate's scent and will not stop running until he reaches her. He stood, walked to the door, and began issuing orders that would turn his entire kingdom upside down. Sable had planned to disappear. She walked through the night and all of the following day, staying off the main roads. By the second night, she reached a river crossing where a merchant offered her a seat among the flour sacks in exchange for help unloading. She arrived in the village of Koragbend 4 days later. It sat at the southern edge of Craythorn's territory, nestled between sea cliffs and the ancient forest the locals called the Thornwood. Small, remote. The kind of place where people asked nothing of strangers beyond basic decency. She told the village elder that her name was Neoma, a widow, a healer, looking for a quiet place to wait out her grief and her pregnancy. The elder, a weathered woman named Orvessa, had looked at Sable's swollen wrist, her hollow eyes, and the barely visible curve of her belly, and had asked no further questions. "The cottage past the mill has been empty since last autumn," Orvessa said. "The roof needs mending, but the hearth works. You can have it if you keep it in repair and tend to the village's cuts and fevers." Sable had moved in that same afternoon. Now, 5 months later, summer was pressing against the last stubborn rains, and Neoma the healer had become a quiet fixture of Koragbend. She delivered a breech calf for the farmer on the hill. She brewed willow bark tea for the children's fevers. She set the fisherman's dislocated shoulder and wrapped the baker's burned hand. And every night, she sat in her cottage with her hands on the growing curve beneath her ribs and tried not to think about the man who had put this child inside her and then chosen someone else while she watched. The baby moved constantly now. Strong, insistent kicks that sometimes came from 2 places at once, as if more than one small body was making itself known. The village midwife, a cheerful woman named Dagna, had pressed her ear to Sable's stomach during a routine visit and gone very still. 2 heartbeats, Dagna said carefully. "You are carrying twins." Sable had stared at the ceiling and said nothing. Twins. The Alpha King's twins, growing inside a runaway servant in a fishing village at the edge of the world. The promise mark on her wrist had not faded. Among wolf kind, a rejected bond was supposed to dissolve. The mark should have disappeared within days, leaving clean skin and a dull ache that would eventually become nothing. Instead, it had deepened. What had been a faint impression of teeth had become a raised scar, dark and warm to the touch at all hours. It pulsed when the wind blew from the north. It ached when she dreamed, which was every night, because every night she dreamed of the real him. Not the hollow-eyed puppet on the dais, but the man who had pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that his wolf knew. "You are strong," she whispered to her belly in the darkness. "You will have to be. You will not have a father. You will not have a kingdom. But you will have me, and I will be enough." She tried to believe it. She almost succeeded. And then the peddlers came. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 of them with a mule cart loaded with fabric, spices, and gossip from the capital. Sable avoided them, as she avoided all strangers, but the village was small and news traveled fast. Dagna brought it to her door before noon. "The peddlers say the king has gone mad," Dagna reported breathlessly. "He has broken off the betrothal to the Kendrosian woman. Threw her family out of the castle. The council is furious. 3 noble houses have withdrawn their support." Sable forced her expression neutral. "Why would he do such a thing?" "Nobody knows. But he is searching for someone. A woman. 50 patrol units sent to every province, every village, every settlement. The reward is 12,000 gold pieces. 12,000 gold. More money than the entire village of Koragaband would see in a generation." Sable's hand moved to her wrist beneath her sleeve, pressing against the mark that suddenly burned hotter than it had in weeks. "And there is one more thing," Dagna added, lowering her voice. "The peddlers say he carries something with him at all times. A stack of papers, bound in leather. He reads them constantly. He will not let anyone else touch them. One of the kitchen staff at the castle told the peddlers that she heard the king speaking to the papers late at night, as if the words inside them were a person he was trying to reach." The room tilted beneath Sable's feet. The manuscript. He had found her manuscript. He had found 212 pages of her heart laid bare, every secret feeling and stolen memory written in her own hand, and he was carrying it with him, reading it, speaking to it in the dark. Sable gripped the edge of her work table and forced air into her lungs. "Are you well?" Dagna asked with concern. "You have gone white as salt." "I am fine. The baby makes me dizzy sometimes." "Twins will do that," Dagna agreed sympathetically. "Shall I bring you some broth?" "No, thank you, Dagna. I think I need to rest." After the midwife left, Sable sank to the floor beside her hearth and pressed both hands to the curve of her stomach. The twins kicked in unison, a synchronized percussion that felt almost like a response. He was searching for her. He had read every word she had written and torn his kingdom apart. Why would the Alpha King of Craythorn destroy his own political alliances for a servant he had publicly discarded? Why would he carry her manuscript like a holy text and speak to it in the darkness? Unless the man on the dais that night had not been the real Roderick Vile at all. The promise mark on her wrist flared with sudden heat, and for one dizzying moment, Sable felt something through it. Not pain. Not the dull burn she had grown accustomed to. A presence, vast and searching, clawing at the edges of her awareness like a wolf scratching at a locked door. Then it was gone. Sable sat in the silence of her cottage, her heart hammering, her babies kicking, and the ruins of her certainty scattered around her like broken glass. She had been so sure he had thrown her away. Now she was not sure of anything at all. And somewhere to the north, getting closer with every passing day, a wolf with silver eyes was following a trail that led straight to her door. The knock came at dusk. Not the casual rap of a neighbor or the tentative tap of a patient seeking help after hours. This was a deliberate, measured knock. 3 strikes, a pause, then 2 more. A military pattern. Sable's blood turned cold. She set down the cup of nettle tea she had been nursing and moved silently to the window. The thornwood behind her cottage was dark, the last light of day retreating behind the sea cliffs. She could see nothing unusual in the lane. But the mark on her wrist was burning. Not the low simmer she had grown accustomed to over the past 5 months. This was a deep, insistent heat that radiated up her forearm and made her fingers tingle. Something connected to the bond was close. The knock came again. Same pattern. Patient. Unhurried. Sable picked up the iron fire poker and moved toward the door. Her belly had grown large enough now that she had to adjust her stance. One hand gripping the poker, the other resting instinctively on the curve where the twins pressed outward. She opened the door. 2 figures stood on her threshold. The first was a woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. A long scar crossed her left cheekbone from temple to jaw, and her eyes, deep brown and watchful, swept over Sable with the efficiency of someone trained to assess threats in a single glance. The second figure was smaller, older, wrapped in a traveling cloak that had seen better seasons. When the hood fell back, Sable saw a face she recognized. Marta, she breathed. Marta Dunhaven, the castle seamstress who had mended Sable's only good dress. The woman who had once pressed a honey cake into her hand during a long shift and whose knowing eyes suggested she understood far more than she ever said. "May we come in?" Marta asked. "We have traveled a very long way, and what I have to tell you cannot be said on a doorstep." Sable's grip tightened on the poker. "How did you find me?" The warrior woman spoke for the first time. "My name is Katrin. I am second guard to the Alpha King. We have been searching for you for nearly 5 months, across 3 provinces, 2 river crossings, and 1 very unhelpful merchant in Dunlow Bridge, who eventually remembered a pregnant woman riding among his flour sacks. You are here on his orders." "No." Marta stepped forward, her weathered face tight with urgency. "We are here against his orders, or rather, without them. There are things you must know, Sable, and there are people who do not want you to know them." Against every instinct screaming at her to close the door, Sable stepped aside. Marta entered first, Katrin following with one last scan of the darkening lane behind them. The warrior positioned herself beside the window without being asked, her hand resting on the short blade at her hip. "You should sit down," Marta said gently. "I would rather stand." "Then hold on to something." Marta drew a breath. The night of the Ascension Ball, someone poisoned the king. The fire poker slipped from Sable's fingers and clattered against the stone floor. "Poisoned," she repeated. The word felt foreign in her mouth. "A compound mixed into a cup of spiced wine. We believe it was derived from moonveil root, which suppresses a wolf's instincts and severs the connection between the human mind and the animal consciousness. In sufficient quantity, it can render a wolf completely passive, controllable, a body moving without a will behind it." Sable's knees buckled. She caught herself on the back of her chair and lowered herself into it, her mind racing. The flat eyes, the mechanical movements, the complete absence of recognition, not indifference, not rejection. Poison. Who? The word came out strangled. "We believe it was the Kendrosians." Katrin spoke from the window, her voice low and controlled. "The spiced wine was a gift from their delegation. Lord Kendrosian presented it personally. We did not suspect it at the time because refusing a diplomatic gift would have been a grave insult." "We should have suspected it," Marta said bitterly. "The Kendrosians have wanted their bloodline on the throne for 2 generations. Phaedra was their instrument. The betrothal was their weapon. And you, Sable, were the obstacle they needed to remove." "Remove," Sable whispered. Marta reached into her cloak and withdrew a folded paper. The seal was broken, but Sable could see the Kendrosian crest pressed into dark red wax. A mountain cat crouching over crossed swords. Katrin intercepted this from a courier 2 weeks ago. It was addressed to a man in the Southern Territories, a man known for making problems disappear. Sable unfolded the letter with numb fingers. The message was 3 lines. "The healer woman has been located in a coastal settlement south of the Thornwood. Payment upon confirmation of completion. The matter must be resolved before the king's search reaches the southern border." The paper trembled in Sable's hands. "They want me dead." "They want you and the child dead," Katrin corrected quietly. "A living mate with a living heir is a threat to everything the Kendrosians have built. As long as you exist, their hold on the throne is temporary." "Their hold." Sable looked up sharply. "Phaedra is still at the castle." "She refuses to leave," Marta said. "She maintains the oath is binding under ancient law. Her father has petitioned the council to enforce it. And Roderick? The name tasted like ashes and honey at once. The king is not well. Marta's voice softened. He reads your manuscript constantly. He has memorized passages. The pages are worn soft where his fingers have traced the same words over and over again. Sable closed her eyes. Roderick alone in his study, reading her private words by candlelight. Carrying her story against his chest like a talisman against madness. His wolf is deteriorating, Katrin added. The severed bond, the poisoning, the separation. 2 months ago, he shifted during a council meeting and could not shift back for 2 days. If he does not find you soon, Marta said, his wolf will take permanent control. A feral alpha with Roderick's power would be catastrophic. The mark on her wrist pulsed with heat. Deep beneath her skin, she felt that presence again. The searching. The desperate, wordless need pushing against the edges of her consciousness. He was closer than before. Much closer. Why did you come to me instead of bringing him here? Sable asked. Because the Kendrasians are watching his every move, Katrin said. Every wolf in his search party has been tracked. If we had led him directly to you, the assassins would have followed. We needed to reach you first, to warn you, to give you the choice. What choice? Marta knelt before Sable's chair and took her hands. Her old fingers were warm and rough against Sable's cold skin. The choice to come back. Not as a servant summoned by a king, but as a mate returning on her own terms. Marta squeezed her hands. He has read every word you wrote. He knows. And it is destroying him that he cannot find you to tell you that every word was true for him as well. Before Sable could respond, Katrin stiffened at the window. Movement in the thornwood, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. 3 shapes. No, 4. Moving in formation. Marta rose instantly, her face draining of color. They are here, she breathed. The Kendrosian hunters found us. Katrin had her blade drawn before the first shadow reached the tree line. Back door, the warrior commanded. Is there one? It leads to the goat pen, Sable said, her healer's calm settling over her despite the terror clawing at her chest. Beyond that, the cliff path down to the beach. Too exposed. They will see you on the cliffs before you reach the sand. Katrin moved to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. How many exits does this cottage have? 2, the front door and the back. Then we hold the front and hope they do not circle. Katrin glanced at Marta. Get her into the cellar if there is one. There is no cellar, Sable said. An arrow punched through the shuttered window and embedded itself in the far wall. The shaft was black. The tip gleamed with something wet and acrid. Nightbloom extract, Sable said, recognizing the smell instantly. Her healer's training identified it before her fear could. On the arrowheads, it will paralyze a shifted wolf in seconds. So they came prepared for wolves, Katrin muttered grimly. At least that means they do not know I am the only fighter here. She pulled Sable away from the window. Stay low, stay behind the hearth wall. A second arrow split the wood of the door, spraying splinters across the room. Marta threw herself over Sable's body, shielding her belly with her own torso. Marta, no. Sable pushed the older woman aside. You cannot protect me by dying first. Then protect yourself, child. Use whatever you have. Whatever she had. Sable's mind raced. She was a healer with herbs and stitching thread. She did not have weapons or combat training. She was 6 months pregnant and her most dangerous possession was a fire poker on the floor. But she had something else. Something she had discovered the night the twins were conceived, when Roderick's half-claim ignited a channel of power she had never felt before. She had dismissed it as the intensity of the moment. She had been wrong. The front door exploded inward. 2 figures rushed through, dressed in dark leather, faces hidden behind featureless black masks. They moved with predatory coordination, blades drawn. Katrin met the first with a clash of steel that shook the walls, driving the attacker backward through the shattered doorframe. The second hunter lunged toward Sable. Marta screamed, and Sable threw her hands forward. The light that erupted from her palms was silver white, the color of moonlight on fresh snow. The hunter was lifted off the ground and hurled backward through the window, vanishing into the darkness. Sable stared at her glowing hands. Pale light pulsed beneath her skin in visible threads, concentrated most intensely around the scar on her left wrist. The twins kicked wildly inside her, both at once, as if responding to the power their mother had unleashed. "What in the name of the old wolves was that?" Marta whispered from the floor. Sable had no answer. She only knew the light was still there, humming beneath her skin, connected to the bond that still tied her to Roderick despite everything. Outside, Katrin's fight had spilled into the lane. Sable could hear the ring of blades and the grunts of combat. The warrior was holding her own, but she was one against at least two, and the hunters had come prepared. A third figure appeared in the ruined doorway. This one did not carry a blade. She carried a crossbow, its bolt loaded and aimed directly at Sable's chest. Behind the black mask, a pair of ice-blue eyes studied her with clinical detachment. "The king's little author," the woman said. Her voice was cultured, cold. "My sister told me about the manuscript, a servant girl writing love letters disguised as fiction. How tragically ordinary. Sister. Phaedra's sister." "Meridia Kendrosian," Sable said. "Clever girl." Her finger tightened on the crossbow trigger. "The terms of my contract require only your death. You have complicated things with that little light display. Then let me complicate them further." Sable pressed her palms together and pulled. The silver-white light responded, but differently this time. Instead of a blast, it flowed outward in a wave, filling the room like water filling a basin. It touched Marta and left her unharmed. It touched the walls and merely brightened them. But when it reached Meridia Kendrosian, the assassin gasped and staggered. The crossbow bolt fired wild, punching into the ceiling. The weapon clattered from her hands. "What are you?" Meridia hissed, clutching her chest. "A healer," Sable said. "And a mother. And apparently something else entirely." Meridia scrambled for her crossbow, but the light pulsed again and she screamed, a sound of agony rather than fear. Whatever Sable's power was, it did not simply push. It reached into the body and found the places where harm lived. In a healer, it mended. In an enemy, it exposed every wound, every weakness, every point of vulnerability. Meridia fled through the doorway, and the remaining hunters retreated with her. The sounds of the thornwood swallowed them whole. Katrin stumbled back inside, bleeding from a cut above her eye. She stared at Sable with an expression of awe and disbelief. "How long have you been able to do that?" "It has never happened before tonight," Sable admitted. "It is the bond," Marta said softly from where she sat against the wall. "The mate bond channeled through the pregnancy. The children are amplifying your power, Sable. Whatever healing gift you carried before, the twins have turned it into something far greater." Sable pressed her hands to her belly and felt two tiny bodies pushing against her palms. "They saved us," she whispered. "They did," Marta agreed. "But the Kendrosians will return, with more hunters, with weapons designed to counter what you just did. And next time, Katrin alone will not be enough." Katrin was binding her own wound with practiced efficiency. "The seamstress is right. We need to move, or we need reinforcements." "No." Sable's voice came out harder than she intended. "I will not run again. I spent 5 months running, and all it did was give my enemies time to find me at their leisure. I will not raise my children in a life of constant flight." "Then what do you suggest?" Katrin asked. Before Sable could answer, the scar on her wrist erupted with a heat so intense she cried out. The silver-white light flared beneath her skin unbidden, and through the bond, she felt something that drove the breath from her lungs. He was here, not close, here, in the thornwood, less than a mile from her door, and he was not alone. A howl split the night air, deep, resonant, carrying a fury that vibrated in Sable's bones and made every wolf within earshot drop to the ground in instinctive submission. He had found her. The wolf that emerged from the thornwood was the color of a winter storm. Silver-gray fur covered a body that was impossibly large, taller than any warhorse, with paws that left impressions a grown man could stand in. His eyes blazed silver-white in the darkness. He stopped at the edge of her garden. Behind him, dozens of wolves materialized from the trees, fanning out in a protective perimeter. He stood at the garden gate, his massive head lowered. He was asking permission. The most powerful wolf in Craythorne was standing at her gate like a stray hoping to be let in. Sable's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. The promise mark on her wrist pulsed in time with his breathing, a synchronized rhythm that proved what she had spent all those months trying to deny. The bond had never broken. "Shift," she said quietly. "If you want to speak to me, do it with a human mouth." The change happened in a ripple of silver light. One heartbeat, a wolf the size of a nightmare. The next, a man kneeling in her garden with his fists pressed against the damp earth and his head bowed. He was thinner than she remembered. The sharp angles of his face had become gaunt, the shadows beneath his eyes deep enough to bruise. His dark hair was longer, unkempt, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look less like a king and more like a man who had stopped caring about anything except the one thing he could not find. He looked up. "Sable," he said, her name in his mouth. After 5 months of silence, after 5 months of believing she would never hear him say it again, it nearly broke her. But Sable Marishaw had rebuilt herself from wreckage. She had learned to set bones and deliver calves and face each morning without the man she loved. She had built walls around the broken pieces of her heart, and she was not going to let them crumble because he knelt in her garden and said her name like it was the only word he knew. "Get up," she said. "I will not have this conversation with you on your knees." Roderick rose. He was barefoot in the wet grass, wearing only the loose trousers that survived a shift, and his body was shaking. Not from the cold, from something far more fundamental. His eyes dropped to her belly. The sound that escaped him was barely human. "You are." He could not finish. His hand reached toward her, trembling, then pulled back. "Sable, you are. Pregnant. With your twins. I was going to tell you the night of the Ascension Ball, but you were busy choosing another woman." Roderick flinched. "I did not choose her. I swear to you, I did not choose her." "I was there, Roderick." 5 months of grief compressed into a voice that could cut glass. "I stood in the gallery and watched you pledge yourself to another woman while I carried your children and bled from a bond you apparently did not feel. I was drugged." His voice cracked. "The Kendrassians poisoned the wine, Moonveil root. It severed my wolf, my memories, my awareness of the bond. I remember nothing of that night. Nothing. I woke up 3 days later in a world where I was betrothed to a woman I despise, and the woman I love had vanished. How convenient." "Convenient?" The word tore out of him. "I have spent 5 months reading your words. Every page, every line. I have held your manuscript against my chest every night, because it is the only proof I have that you were real. That I did not dream the only person who has ever made my wolf go quiet." His voice broke. "I read the final chapter. The one where you describe standing in the gallery. Watching me betray you. Running with your hand on your belly." He pressed his fist to his chest. "Do you know what it is like to read the worst moment of someone's life and know that you caused it, even though you had no will behind any of it?" Sable's carefully constructed walls trembled. She could feel his anguish through the bond, a tidal wave of grief and guilt and desperate love crashing against the barriers she had built. "You did not just read it," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "You marked pages. You traced words with your fingers until the ink wore thin. You spoke to my manuscript in the dark as if I could hear you." Roderick's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "Because the peddlers talk. Because I sat in this cottage and listened to a stranger describe the man I love, pressing his face into pages I wrote with stolen ink, and I could not reach him." Roderick took a step toward her. His eyes were pure silver now, his wolf fully present behind them. "You wrote that the Wolf Lord was your home," he said softly. Chapter 9, page 143. He was not a place or a promise. He was the only coordinates that mattered. He was home, and she had been lost her entire life until she found him. Sable's breath caught. He had memorized the exact page number. "You read all of it," she whispered. "Every word, Sable Marishaw. And you did not write fiction." He stopped an arm's length away. "You wrote the truth. Everything your heart put on those pages, I felt it too. The bond between us is not a story. It is the only real thing I have ever known." Sable's walls broke. The sob that tore from her throat carried the weight of every lonely night and the suffocating pretense of being someone named Neoma who did not love a king. She pressed her hands to her face, but the tears came anyway. Roderick closed the distance and wrapped his arms around her. His hands found the curve of her belly, and when the twins kicked against his palms, his entire body shuddered. "Twins," he breathed against her hair. "You wrote about one child. There are two. I did not know when I wrote it." "Sable." His arms tightened around her. "I am so sorry. For every moment of pain. For every night you spent alone." She wanted to push him away, but his heartbeat was under her ear, and something between them was singing with a resonance that drowned out everything else. "The Kendrasians sent assassins," she said against his chest. "Tonight. They tried to kill me." The arms around her turned to iron. "What?" The single word vibrated with a fury so deep it shook the ground beneath their feet. The wolves in the perimeter lifted their heads, ears flattened, responding to their alpha's rage. Sable pulled back to look at his face. His eyes had gone from silver to white, the color of a wolf on the edge of losing control entirely. "Katrin and Marta found me first. They warned me. And then the hunters came." "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her arms, her shoulders, her belly, checking for wounds with frantic tenderness. "No. I..." She paused. "I stopped them. With something I did not know I could do." Roderick's brow furrowed. Sable held up her left hand, and the silver-white light flickered beneath her skin, faint but visible in the darkness. His breath stopped. "The bond," he whispered. "The mate bond is channeling through you. Through the twins, Marta thinks. They amplified it." Roderick pressed his forehead to hers. The gesture was so familiar, so achingly identical to the night in the garden when everything between them had begun, that Sable's chest constricted with pain and longing in equal measure. "I will find every hunter the Kendrasians sent," he said, his voice low and absolute. "And I will make them answer for raising a weapon against my mate and my children." My mate. My children. The words settled into Sable's bones with a warmth she had not felt since the night she fled. And despite everything, despite the fury and the grief, and the devastating knowledge of what had been stolen from them both, she felt the scar on her wrist pulse once in answer. Not with pain, with recognition. But before either of them could speak again, Katrin appeared in the doorway with blood still drying on her face and an urgency in her voice that killed the moment dead. "Your Majesty, a rider has come from Harrowgate. The Kendrasians have moved against the castle. Lord Kendrasian has declared you unfit to rule and named Phaedra as Regent Queen. They have taken the throne." For 3 heartbeats, No one moved. Then Roderick turned to face the darkness where his wolves waited, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold precision of a king who has stopped negotiating. "How many hold the castle?" The rider, a young wolf named Fennec whose face was streaked with road dust and dried blood, answered from one knee. "Lord Kendrasian brought 200 warriors through the eastern gate at midnight. They had allies inside. Counselor Branneth opened the gates for them." Branneth, the High Counselor who had announced the betrothal, the same man who had handed Roderick the poisoned wine. "Of course," Roderick said quietly. "He was part of it from the beginning." Sable watched the fury settle into him. Not the explosive rage she had seen moments ago, but something colder, harder. The kind of anger that does not burn out because it has stopped being emotion and become decision. "Hostages?" Roderick asked. Fennec swallowed. 43 members of the household staff who refused to swear loyalty to Phaedra. They are being held in the Great Hall. Lord Kendrasian has declared that they will face judgment at dawn for treason against the new queen. "Judgment!" Katrin spat from the doorway. "He means execution." Sable's hand went to her mouth. 43 people. Cooks, stable hands, cleaners. The people who had shared their meals with her, who had treated her with kindness during her months at the castle. "Haskell?" she asked, dreading the answer. Fennec nodded grimly. The steward was among the first taken. He tried to hide the king's personal belongings before the Kendrosians reached the royal chambers. They caught him carrying a leather satchel. The manuscript. Sable looked at Roderick. He met her gaze, and she saw the moment he understood. Haskell had tried to save her pages, had risked his life for a stack of parchment because he knew what those words meant to his king. "We ride to Harrogate tonight," Roderick said. "Every wolf I have." "You are outnumbered," Katrin pointed out. "Kendrasian has 200 warriors behind stone walls. You have perhaps 60 wolves and no siege equipment." "I do not need siege equipment." Roderick looked at Sable. "I need to get inside the Great Hall before dawn. If I can face Kendrosian directly, I can end this without a prolonged battle. But I cannot reach the hall if 200 warriors are standing between me and the gates." Sable understood what he was not saying. He needed a distraction. He needed something that would draw Kendrosian's forces away from the Great Hall long enough for the king to reach the hostages. He needed her. "No," Roderick said, reading her expression. "Whatever you are thinking, no. You do not know what I am thinking." "I know exactly what you are thinking because I have read 212 pages of how your mind works. And you are thinking that if you offer yourself to Kendrasian as a prize more valuable than hostages, he will pull his forces inward to secure you and leave the outer defenses weakened." Sable blinked. "That is disturbingly accurate. You wrote a character who does exactly this in Chapter 7 of your manuscript. The healer offers herself as a hostage to save a village." His jaw tightened. "I will not let you walk into that castle alone." "Then walk in with me." Roderick stared at her. "Not through the front gate," Sable continued, her healer's mind already assembling the plan with clinical clarity. "The servants' corridors. I lived in that castle for a year. I know every passage, every hidden staircase, every forgotten door. I can get us inside the Great Hall without a single Kendrosian seeing us. You are 6 months pregnant with twins, and apparently capable of throwing assassins through windows. I think I can manage a staircase." Despite everything, despite the coup and the hostages and the army waiting to kill them both, the corner of Roderick's mouth twitched. "You really did write yourself into that book," he murmured, brave to the point of recklessness. "I learned it from the Wolf Lord of Ashenmere." His eyes softened. For one moment, the king and the war and the kingdom disappeared, and there was only a man looking at the woman who had written their love story and hidden it beneath floorboards because the world was not ready to hear it. "Together," he said. "We go together. And if anything threatens you or the children, you let me stand between you and the danger. That is my condition." Sable took his hand and pressed it to her belly. The twins kicked against his palm, strong and sure. Together, she agreed. They reached Harrogate in the dead hours before dawn. Roderick's wolves surrounded the castle in a silent perimeter while Sable led the king, Catrin, and a small strike force of 12 warriors through the drainage tunnel beneath the eastern wall. It was narrow, damp, and reeked of decades of disuse, but Sable had discovered it during her first month at the castle when she had been searching for wild thyme in the outer ditches. She had never imagined she would use it to retake a kingdom. They emerged in the lower cellars beneath the kitchen stores. The corridors above were patrolled, but Sable knew the rotation schedules of the household staff, and the Kendrasians had kept the same patterns to maintain the appearance of normalcy. "Third bell," she whispered. "The patrol crosses the north corridor. We have 4 minutes to reach the servants' passage behind the Great Hall." Roderick moved beside her in silence, his hand never leaving the small of her back. Through the bond, she could feel his wolf straining against its leash, desperate to shift, to fight, to tear through every obstacle between them and the people who had stolen his home. But he held. For her, he held. They reached the servants' passage without incident. Through the thin wall, Sable could hear voices in the great hall. Lord Kendrosian giving orders, the shuffle of guards, and beneath it all, the quiet weeping of the hostages who believed they would die at dawn. Sable pressed her ear to the wall and listened. "The king will come," Kendrosian was saying, his voice carrying the brittle confidence of a man who had gambled everything on a single hand. "He has no choice. When he does, we take him alive. A living king forced to abdicate is worth more than a dead one who becomes a martyr." "And the woman?" Phaedra's voice, cold, impatient. "Meridia has not reported back. If the healer survived, she will come with him. Then we deal with her before his eyes. Let him watch his little servant fall before he signs the abdication. That should simplify his decision." Sable felt Roderick's hand tighten against her back. Through the bond, his rage was a white-hot wire, vibrating at a frequency that made her teeth ache. She turned to face him in the darkness, pressed her palm against his chest, felt his heart slamming against her hand. "Let me go in first," she whispered. "No. Roderick, listen to me. He expects you. He does not expect me. If I walk through that door alone, every eye in the room will be on the pregnant woman who should be dead. Every guard will turn. Every weapon will shift. And in that moment, you come through the passage with 12 wolves and end this. You are asking me to use you as bait. I am asking you to trust the woman who wrote a 200-page love letter to you and hid it under her bed because she was too afraid to say the words out loud." She held his gaze in the darkness. "I am not afraid anymore, Roderick. I have been afraid since the night I ran, and I am done. Let me finish this." His forehead dropped to hers. The familiar gesture, the one that meant everything. "If anyone touches you," he breathed, "I will not be able to control what happens next. Then make sure you are fast." She kissed him, brief, fierce, a promise sealed with the taste of salt and adrenaline. Then Sable Marishaw, former servant, secret author, pregnant healer with moonlight running through her veins, straightened her spine and pushed open the door to the great hall. Every head turned. Lord Aldrich Kendrasian stood on the raised dais at the far end of the hall, flanked by his personal guard. Phaedra sat in the king's chair behind him, wearing a crown that did not belong to her, her auburn hair catching the torchlight. 43 hostages knelt in rows before the dais, their hands bound, their faces hollow with exhaustion and terror. Sable's eyes found old Haskell in the second row. He was bleeding from a cut on his temple and clutched against his chest. Still gripped in his bound hands was a leather satchel. Her manuscript. He had protected it. Even now, even facing execution, the old steward held her pages against his heart. "You," Phaedra breathed from the throne. Sable walked forward. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone floor. The silver-white light hummed beneath her skin, but she held it in check. Not yet. Not yet. I am Sable Marishaw, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the great hall. The woman your family poisoned a king to remove, the woman your sister tried to murder in a fishing village, the woman who carries the true heirs of Craythorne. She stopped in the center of the hall, surrounded by guards, their blades angled toward her throat. And I am here to tell you that this ends now. Kendrasian recovered from his shock with practiced speed. Seize her. She is the final piece. With the girl and the heirs, we hold everything we need. Guards moved toward her from 3 directions. Sable waited. She counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 5th, she released the light. It erupted from her body in a sphere of blinding silver-white radiance. The guards stumbled, shielding their eyes. The hostages gasped. Phaedra screamed from the throne. And behind Sable, the servant's door exploded open. Roderick came through in wolf form, a storm of silver-gray fury that hit the first line of Kendrosian guards before they could turn. His 12 warriors followed, shifting mid-stride, their bodies becoming weapons as they crashed into the disoriented defenders. The great hall became chaos. Sable dropped to her knees beside the hostages and pressed her glowing hands to the ropes binding Haskell's wrists. The fibers snapped as if cut by invisible blades. She moved to the next hostage, then the next. Her power flowed through her fingers with a precision she had not known she possessed, finding bonds and breaking them, finding wounds and closing them, moving down the line with the focused efficiency of a healer who has finally found a purpose equal to her gift. Run, she told each freed captive, through the servants' passage. Go now. They ran. But Kendrasian was not finished. The old lord had retreated to the dais, pulling his daughter behind him. In his hand was a blade that Sable recognized with a shock of horror. A Moonveil-forged dagger, the same compound that had poisoned Roderick, distilled into a weapon. One cut from that blade would sever a wolf from its animal spirit permanently. "Roderick!" she screamed. Too late. Kendrasian lunged as the Alpha King's wolf tore through the last guard between them. The dagger caught Roderick's shoulder, and the effect was instantaneous. The massive wolf staggered, his silver eyes flickering, his form rippling between human and animal, as the Moonveil fought to sever the bond between man and beast. Roderick crashed to the floor, half-shifted, his body convulsing as the poison spread through his blood. Kendrasian raised the dagger for a killing stroke. The silver-white light did not ask Sable's permission. It erupted from the promise mark on her wrist and roared through her body with a force that lifted her hair and made the stones beneath her feet crack. The twins moved inside her, not kicking now but pushing, as if pressing their hands against the walls of her womb and pouring everything they had into their mother. Sable did not throw the light this time. She became it. Her feet left the ground. The radiance expanded outward from her body in concentric waves, each one carrying the force of the mate bond at full strength. It passed over the freed hostages and left them untouched. It passed over Roderick's wolves and left them strengthened, their movements becoming faster, their strikes more precise. When it reached Lord Kendrasian, it hit him like a wall. The dagger flew from his hand. His body was flung backward across the dais, crashing into the throne where Phaedra cowered. The silver-white light wrapped around him and held him pinned, not with physical force but with something deeper. Something that reached into his body the way Sable's healing reached into a wound, except that instead of mending, it found every act of cruelty, every calculated harm, every poisoned cup and paid assassin and whispered conspiracy, and it held them up for the entire hall to witness. Kendrasian screamed, not in pain, but in exposure. The light was stripping away his armor of politics and pretense, leaving nothing but the raw truth of what he was. You poisoned a king, Sable said, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated with the ancient stone of Harrogate itself. You stole his will and his voice and his choice. You tried to murder his mate and his unborn children. You imprisoned innocence and stole a crown. She floated toward the dais, her feet inches above the cracked stone, her eyes blazing with silver fire. And you did all of it because you believed that power was something you could take. She stopped before him. You were wrong. Power is not a throne or a title or a blade coated in poison. Power is the bond between two souls who chose each other against every force that tried to tear them apart. She turned to where Roderick lay on the floor, still convulsing from the moonveil cut. She knelt beside him and pressed her glowing hands to the wound on his shoulder. The healing was different from anything she had done before. It was not just mending flesh. It was reaching into the place where the poison was trying to sever Roderick from his wolf, and wrapping the bond in light so bright that the moon veil burned away like shadow at noon. Roderick gasped. His eyes flew open, pure blazing silver, and his hand found hers and gripped it with desperate strength. Sable, he choked. I am here. She pressed her forehead to his. I am right here. Through the bond, she felt the poison recede. Felt his wolf surge back to full awareness, howling with relief and fury. Felt the connection between them blaze brighter than it had ever been. Roderick stood. The Alpha King rose to his full height, healed, restored, his silver eyes incandescent with power. He turned to face Kendrausian, still pinned against the throne by Sable's light. Lord Aldrich Kendrausian, Roderick said, you are charged with treason, poisoning the crown, attempted murder of the true Queen of Craythorne, and conspiracy to destroy the mate bond. Kendrausian's face was gray with terror. You cannot prove any of this. I do not need to prove it. Roderick stepped aside, revealing Sable, still glowing with silver light, her hand resting on the swell of her pregnancy where the twins had fallen silent at last. She has already shown every wolf in this hall exactly what you are. Phaedra attempted to flee. Katrin caught her before she reached the door, pinning the false queen against the stone wall with one scarred hand. Going somewhere, Your Majesty? Katrin asked with grim satisfaction. It was over. The dawn came slowly over Harrogate. Sable stood at the window of the king's private chambers, watching light spread across the kingdom she had fled from on a winter night that felt like a lifetime ago. The castle was quiet now. The Kendrausian warriors had surrendered within the hour once their lord was taken. Most had been following orders, not ideology, and they laid down their weapons with something that looked like relief. Behind her, Roderick sat at his desk. On the desk, placed with careful reverence, lay her manuscript. 212 pages of stolen ink and borrowed parchment, still bearing the creases from being hidden under a loose floorboard. Still bearing the marks where his fingers had worn the paper soft. The passage in Chapter 4, Roderick said quietly, where the Wolf Lord tells the healer that he can hear her heartbeat from across the castle, that he falls asleep to the sound of it. Sable turned from the window. What about it? Was that true? You tell me. Roderick closed his eyes. I can hear it now. Both of them, actually. 3 heartbeats. Yours and theirs. Sable crossed the room and stood before him. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the twins shifted lazily, peacefully, as if the night's chaos had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. You read every word I wrote, she said. Every word. Even the parts I thought were too embarrassing to keep. The parts where I described the way your voice sounds when you are tired. The part where I admitted I had memorized the number of steps between my chamber and yours. 47, by the way. 47, he repeated softly. I counted once. I got 48. You have longer legs. He laughed. It was a broken, exhausted, beautiful sound, and it cracked something open inside Sable that she had been holding shut since the night she fled. I need to complete the bond, Roderick said. Properly. The half-claim protected us both, but it is not enough. Not anymore. I know. Sable. He looked up at her, and his eyes held none of the king's authority, none of the Alpha's command. Only the raw honesty of a man who had read a woman's secret heart and found his own reflected in every page. Before I ask you, I need you to know something. What? Your manuscript is not fiction. You know that, and I know that. But it is also not just a record of what happened. He opened the pages to a passage she recognized. You wrote a version of me that is braver than I have ever been. Kinder. More certain. Roderick. I am not that man. I wavered. I waited too long to claim you publicly. I gave the Kendrosians an opening because I was trying to protect you through politics, instead of simply standing before the kingdom and saying you were mine. He turned the manuscript to the final page, the one she had written the night before the Ascension Ball, with tears smudging the ink. But this woman, he touched the page, the woman who wrote these words, she deserves the man she imagined, and I will spend the rest of my life becoming him, if you will let me. Sable took his face in her hands. The mark on her wrist glowed faintly against his jaw. I did not write a better version of you, she said. I wrote the version of you that I saw. The one you show when no one important is watching. The one who held my hands while I cried and never asked me to stop. The one who pressed his forehead to mine and told me his wolf knew. She leaned down and pressed her lips to the spot where his neck met his shoulder. His pulse hammered against her mouth. Claim me, she whispered. Finish what you started in the garden. Roderick's teeth sank into the curve of her left shoulder, the full mating bite, complete and permanent. The bond ignited. It was not like the half-claim. The half-claim had been a candle. This was the sun. Sable felt Roderick's entire being pour into her through the mark. Every memory, every fear, every sleepless night spent reading her manuscript by candlelight. She saw herself through his eyes, not as a servant or a healer or a woman who hid her feelings in fiction, but as the gravitational center of his existence. The person whose heartbeat he had fallen asleep to from 48 steps away. The person whose absence had nearly cost him his mind, and he felt her. Every page she had written, every word she had hidden. Every night in her tiny cottage when she had pressed her hands to her belly and told their children that they would be enough. Just the three of them, even though the lie had tasted like ash in her mouth. When the bond settled, they were both shaking. Sable bit him in return. Her teeth found the same spot on his shoulder, and the reciprocal claim sealed the bond completely. 2 marks. 2 wolves. 2 hearts that had found each other through poisoned wine and secret manuscripts, and months of silence that had nearly destroyed them both. My queen, Roderick said, his voice wrecked and reverent. My king, she answered. My wolf lord of Ashenmere. He laughed again, and this time the sound was whole. Lord Aldrich Kendrosian faced the final judgment 3 days later, after a trial that lasted 4 hours and a unanimous verdict. His crimes were read aloud in the Great Hall, where he had held 43 innocent people at knife point. And when the sentence was carried out, not a single voice in Craythorne raised an objection. Phaedra was stripped of her name and exiled to the northern wastes beyond the mountain passes. She would live, but she would live as no one, in the cold and the silence, with nothing but the knowledge of what her ambition had cost. Meridia was found 3 weeks later in a border village, still suffering from the injuries Sable's power had inflicted. She was returned to Craythorne and imprisoned. Councillor Branneth confessed under questioning that he had conspired with the Kendrosians for 2 years, facilitating the poisoning and manipulating council votes to force the betrothal ultimatum. He was stripped of his title and banished, and his seat was given to Catrin, who became the first non-noble to serve on the Alpha King's Council in Craythorne's history. Marta Dunhaven was appointed head of the royal household, a position she accepted with characteristic practicality and a private smile that suggested she had always known things would end this way. Old Haskell was given a commendation and a new leather satchel, finer than the one he had nearly died protecting. He carried it everywhere, though these days it held nothing more dangerous than the daily correspondence, and a small flask of honeyed tea that Sable brewed for his joints. The kingdom healed. It happened slowly, the way all true healing does. The wolves who had grown restless and wild during Roderick's months of searching settled as the completed bond radiated stability through the pack. The crops that had withered under the shadow of a broken king found sunlight again. The trade routes reopened. The southern villages, including a small fishing settlement called Korok Bend, received the king's personal protection and a permanent garrison, led by a cheerful midwife named Dagna, who had been granted the honorary title of royal birth attendant and had absolutely no intention of letting anyone forget it. And on a warm evening in late summer, as the sun painted the sky above Harrogate in shades of amber and rose, Sable Marishaw gave birth to twins. A boy, small and dark-haired, who opened his silver eyes and looked at his father with an expression of calm assessment that made every wolf in the room lower their head in instinctive recognition. They named him Corwin. A girl, smaller still, with hair the color of moonlight and a cry so fierce it rattled the windows. When Katrin held her for the first time, the baby gripped the warrior's scarred finger and would not let go. They named her Leora. Roderick held his children with a tenderness that belied his size, cradling them against his chest as if they were made of parchment and ink. Which, in a sense, they were. They had existed first as words on a page, a hope so fragile that their mother had hidden it beneath a floorboard rather than speak it aloud. Now they were real. Now they were here. "I have something for you," Roderick told Sable that evening, after the twins had been fed and swaddled and placed in the cradle that Haskell had built by hand, from oak harvested in the lower garden. He reached beneath the bed and withdrew a parcel wrapped in soft leather. Sable opened it with hands that still trembled from the effort of bringing 2 lives into the world. Inside was her manuscript, every page. But the leather binding was new, rich and dark, stamped with 2 symbols intertwined, a wolf and a quill. And on the first page, beneath her opening line, Roderick had written a single sentence in his own careful hand. Every word was true, and every word was ours. Sable pressed the manuscript to her chest, the same way he had carried it across a broken kingdom, and wept. Not with grief. Not anymore. With the overwhelming, bone-deep relief of a woman whose secret had finally become her story, whose fiction had become her future, whose words, hidden and stolen and written in borrowed ink by candlelight, had led the only man she ever loved straight back to her. Roderick pulled her close, their children sleeping between them, the completed bond humming like a lullaby beneath their skin. "Write the next chapter," he whispered against her hair. Sable smiled. "I think we already are." Outside the window, the wolves of Craythorne lifted their voices in a chorus that carried across the mountains and down to the sea. A song of completion, of justice, of a bond that could not be broken by poison or politics or 212 pages of a manuscript that was never meant to be found. The Alpha King had read every word, and every word had brought him home. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.